Hey gang, Criffmer here, and this is part 1 of how to create a game in Tabletopia. In this video, I'll take you through setting up your game page and starting the whole thing off. Making a game is a very easy process, and Tabletopia has a very good help section if you ever get stuck. We start off by going to the Games section. Scroll down and click on the big blue Create Game button. I'll take you down the left side first. Here we have your option to upload a cover image. This is the image that will be featured in the big list of games, so you want something nice and eye-catching. Next we have the banner image. This image will show up as the header of the game page. You don't need one, but it will make the page nicer. Below that, we have an option to upload images to the game's gallery. The gallery is the series of images that show up under the Join and Play button. It goes a long way toward giving players a feel for the game, looks, and what components it may have. If the game has great artwork, you absolutely want a few gallery images to show it off. At the bottom here, we have a section for links. And finally, a place to upload rules files in PDF format. You can upload multiple files, so if you have your rules translated into multiple languages, you don't have to upload one large file. You can split each language into its own file. On the right side, we have all the critical information for our game: name, type, age range, playing time, and so on. This field is where you enter the name of your game. Below that is space for an alternate name. If your game was published in a different language or a previous printing with a different name, that's where you would put it so players who know the game by that name can find it. The game's type, a classic, abstract, wargame strategy, goes here. Right now you can select 2 different choices for those games that are a bit hard to define. Each game has its own unique URL. It will be automatically generated when you enter the game's name, but if you want to change it to something a bit more unique, you can do so here. If your game is listed on BoardGameGeek, you can enter the URL here, and Tabletopia will include a link on the game page that displays your game's BGG rating. If your game has been physically published, you can enter the ASIN here so people can find it out in the real world. Here is where you select the game's suggested age range. And here is where you select the game's estimated playing time. You may notice there's no field for number of players. That's determined when you define 1 or more setups for your game. Setups are the heart of the game creation system, and we'll get to that in part 3. You can select a number of tags for your game from multiple categories. You can select multiple tags to help players find your game in Tabletopia's database. The game's description will show right under its name, in the middle of the game page. Our sample game for this tutorial will be very simple. Players roll a die and move along a spiral path, and the first one to the center wins. To spice it up a little, we'll add a deck of chance cards, and players draw one if they land on one of the marked spaces. So let's name our game. We'll call it something exciting. And we give it an age range of 7+ and a playing time of 10 to 20 minutes. Let's choose a few tags and see them in action. We can choose tags for multiple categories such as features, genre, setting, any awards the game won, and what languages it's in. Let's tag it by game mechanic and scroll down to find roll, spin, and move. As you can see, we can tag the game with multiple entries from the same category. Very helpful for complex games. We'll give it a brief description. Let's take a detour to look at the permissions you can assign. The first one is self-explanatory. Only you can see and play your game. Public means anyone can see and play your game, and Creative Commons means that anyone can even duplicate the game and create their own using yours as a starting point. Before we publish, let's go add a cover image. Awesome. All set? Let's publish. Now that we have the game page set up, we need the objects that we'll be using in the game. I'll show you how to get them in Part 2. Welcome back! Criffmer here with Part 2 of How to Create a Game in Tabletopia. In this part, we'll learn how to add objects to our game. Let's get started. To get your objects, we naturally go over to the Objects section. Before we start adding anything, let's make sure they're going to the right place. Let's head over to My, which is naturally where all your objects are located. As you can see, Tabletopia automatically created a group for our game, Death Spiral. Groups are like folders. They're Tabletopia's way of organizing objects. Let's go into our Death Spiral group by clicking on it. Now we need the game board, 6 pawns, a die, and a deck of cards. Let's start by grabbing the die and some pawns, which are already created within Tabletopia for us to use. Go to Add Object, and go into either Sandbox or Featured. It doesn't matter which one. Let's look for a nice die to use. This black die will do nicely. Give it a click and click Add Object. Now we want to grab some pawns, but the way I just showed you only adds one object at a time. It would be easier to grab all the pawns together, so let's go up here and click on Featured or Sandbox. Again, it doesn't matter which one for the purposes of this tutorial. Scroll down and we'll go into the group of pawns. Highlight all the objects you want by clicking on the box in the upper right corner and click Add to My. We get a dialog box asking us which group we want to add to. Click Death Spiral and Add to My again, just like when we added the die, and voila! We now have 6 pawns. Now that we have our generic components, we need to create the ones unique to our game, the board and cards. Let's hit the Create Object button and start with the game board. As you can see, the page looks very similar to the Create Game page. Let's start by uploading the image for the board. Click Change and select the image you want to use. Stunning! Beneath that is a few options for the physical board. The magnetic map is an advanced topic we won't cover right now. The map is a PNG file with spots on it that allow cards, tiles, tokens, anything really, to snap to designated spots on the game board. Below that is a scaler you can use to tweak the size of your object. The last option is called Side. It's literally the side of the board. You can choose a thickness and color to give your board a bit of depth. Over on the right is a bunch of fields that should look familiar. Let's give the board a name. We don't really need any of these other fields for now, so let's just publish it. We're taken to the board's object page, and from there we can go right to our Death Spiral group by clicking down here. Now that we have the board, we need some cards. Let's click the Create Object button again, but this time we'll select Card. We want to create 4 cards. 2 will move the players forward, and 2 will move them backward. We create the cards just like the board, only this time there are 2 images, one for the front and one for the back. Let's upload the Move Forward 1 space card. And then this nice star for the back. Let's name it, and before we publish, I want to point out a neat feature. Tabletopia lets you give your cards custom sounds. So if you want to highlight certain important cards, this is a nice way to do it. Now we publish. So now we need 3 more cards, but we don't have to create them from scratch. Tabletopia lets you duplicate objects, making it easy to create things like a deck of cards where you only need to change one thing. You don't have to keep setting all your fields every time you want to create a card for your deck. Let me show you. We now have a lot of objects. Let's do a little housekeeping and create a couple groups to organize things. We may not mind so much in the Objects page here, but we'll want to reduce the clutter for when we go to set up the game in the editor. We'll first create a group for the pawns by clicking on Create New Group. We can move all the pawns just like we added them to our objects by clicking in the boxes and selecting Move To. Let's do the same for the cards, and later I'll explain another reason why we might want to organize objects into groups. Now that we have all of our objects, we're ready to set up the game in the editor so people actually have something to play. I'll cover this in the next section. Welcome back! Krifmer here with part 3 of how to create a game in Tabletopia. In part 1, we set up the game's page so people could find it in the game list. In part 2, we added or created all the objects we need for the game. In this part, we'll create the game itself so people can actually play it. We do this by creating a setup. Setups are literally how the game is set up to play, as if you've taken it out of the box and set it up on your gaming table. Setups are a very powerful and flexible feature. Each game can have multiple setups. For instance, you could set your game up differently for varying numbers of players. Or you could have a setup for each different language if you've translated your game into multiple languages. You can even have one setup that is free to play and one that exists only in the premium catalog. The first thing you might notice is here is where we set the number of players. Different setups can have different numbers of players. Make sure you name your setup so that players know what it is. Setups don't get a description, so the name should be a clue as to what your different setups are. Down here we have the access list. Just like everything else, you can set individual setups to private, public, or Creative Commons. So you could, for instance, have a public version of the game, a Creative Commons version with generic art for people to make fan expansions, and a private setup for you to playtest changes and additions to the game. Underneath everything is your components list. This shows you what components are in this particular setup. So don't worry that none of the objects we just made are down here. They're there, we just haven't put them in the game yet. To put them in the game, we go up to the Edit button. If you've played a game on Tabletopia before, this should look familiar. The Setup Editor is just like the game client, only it has an area at the bottom with all the objects in the game's group so you can add them. This tutorial assumes you're already familiar with Tabletopia's game client. The first thing we want to add is the game board. To add anything to the table, we just drag and drop. Next we add the die and the pawns. As you can see, groups are very helpful to cut down on clutter in the object pane. To go back one step, just click on the path like in your OS file browser. Now for the deck of cards. Now, we can't add a deck of cards all at once. To make a deck of cards, we have to add the individual cards and drag them onto each other to form the deck. Luckily, Tabletopia lets us duplicate objects very easily. So if we want multiple copies of a card, we don't have to drag it onto the table every time. It's also worth noting that you can't drag a card directly into the deck. You have to first put it onto the table so that it loads, and then you can add it to the deck. Let's add 3 of each card to the deck. You can also follow these steps for a stack of tiles or horizontal tokens. Almost any flat objects of identical shape and size can be stacked. Remember, you can hold Shift and drag to select multiple objects at once. So now we have our game all set up, but if you notice, we have a purple player and we selected a black pawn. Let's change that purple seat to black so that everyone matches the pawn colors. To do that, we right-click on the player icon and we can change the color. One last thing before we go. Let's go over to Settings and disable Hands so that players can't accidentally put cards into their hands. Now that we have the game set up, we can save and publish right from the editor, but I want to show you one more thing. Let's go back to the setup page. This deck of cards is fine, but it will always start in the order that we added the cards. We'd have to shuffle it manually every game. Let me show you another way to make a deck of cards that will automatically shuffle each time the game is loaded. Let's go back to the Game Objects page, and I'll show you another reason you want to group objects together. Take a look at this object. This is called a randomizer, and it's only available when you have a group of objects exactly the same size and shape. What it does is pick a random object from the group when the game loads. Think of it like drawing a card from the box. It doesn't just copy that object, it takes it from your group and adds it to the table. So if you make a deck of cards of all randomizers, it will be randomly shuffled each time. Or you can have a game that starts with random tiles, like Settlers of Catan for instance, or Memory. You can place all randomizers down and they'll lay the tiles down randomly for you. Before you can add it to the table, you have to turn it on. You also need to make sure your group includes all the cards or tiles that you'll be using. As you can see, this group only has 1 of each card, and we want 12 cards, 3 of each card. But instead of duplicating objects and making more cards, we can just adjust the number of copies. This number in the corner here indicates how many copies of each object exists within that group. Increasing the number is like duplicating the card and adding more objects, but only where the randomizer is concerned. Now that we have all the cards we need, let's go to the editor and redo the deck with that new randomizer. First, we can get rid of this deck. Now we go to our cards group and add the randomizer. As you can see, there's a number letting us know how many objects are in the group, thus how many randomizers we are allowed to place. Remember, the randomizer isn't just copying the object, it's taking it from the group and putting it on the table. So we can't have more than that number, since there won't be anything left for the rest to turn into. Instead of dragging anything else onto the table, we can just duplicate the randomizer as many times as we want to create our deck. You see? Tabletopia will tell you when there are no more objects left for the randomizer to draw from. Let's put all the cards into the deck and save and publish from the editor. And here's our finished game. Oh, we forgot to turn the deck face down. Keep in mind that when you add randomizers, they will be added to the table face up. Otherwise, this looks pretty good. That's it for our basic tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helped. Now go and make some games.